It began as nothing more than whispers, subtle, almost invisible to the outside world. A few cancelled orders here. A delayed shipment there. Just background noise in the global grain market. But by early 2025, those whispers had turned into something impossible to ignore. American corn, once the undisputed king of global agriculture, was being rejected, delayed, and in some cases, outright replaced. And not replaced by just anyone. Replaced by Canadian grain, quietly sailing into ports across Asia and Europe, signing billion-dollar contracts that the United States had long considered its birthright. The question is, how did the most powerful agricultural exporter on the planet lose its crown so fast? And why does it look like the US might never get it back? For decades, American corn wasn't just a commodity. It was a symbol, reliability, abundance, strength. From Iowa's endless fields to the grain silos along the Mississippi River, US. Corn fed the world, powered ethanol plants, and anchored trade relationships with both allies and rivals. But in 2025, that image is shattered. Across the Midwest, acres of corn sway in the spring wind, but there's no hum of harvesters, no convoys of trucks, no anticipation of sales. Buyers have disappeared. And the shipments that do leave. Many don't make it to their destinations without costly delays, or worse, outright rejection. Prices for US corn have collapsed to levels not seen in nearly a decade. Meanwhile, Canadian corn is selling at premiums American farmers can only watch from the sidelines. Why? Because under President Donald Trump's tightened trade compliance agenda, the Federal Grain Inspection Service raised pesticide residue standards and hiked testing fees by 40%. That meant every single shipment had to pass stricter thresholds before leaving the country. If a shipment failed mid-route, it risked rejection and expensive returns. This wasn't just red tape. It was a chokehold. Barges on the Mississippi slowed to a crawl. In New Orleans, over 180 vessels sat idle, their cargo darkening in the rain while paperwork piled up. And every week of delay shaved nearly 30 cents off the value of each bushel, a loss that most farmers couldn't survive. And then the global market began to shift. Importers weren't just buying in bulk anymore. They wanted grain that was clean, traceable, and environmentally certified. And then came the shock that sent shockwaves through the heartland. Mexico, one of America's most dependable corn buyers, banned imports of genetically modified corn. It joined a growing list of international feed buyers inserting GMO-free clauses into contracts. For US farmers, it was devastating. Over 90% of American corn acreage is genetically modified. Practically overnight, they were locked out of markets they'd dominated for generations. And Canada? Canada was ready. For years, it had been building exactly the agricultural profile the New World market wanted. A blockchain system that tracked every grain kernel from seed to port. Low-carbon certifications. Purity scores that exceeded foreign requirements. So when the US drowned in unsold corn, Canadian exporters stepped in and signed billion-dollar deals with Japan, South Korea, and the European Union. Buyers paid a premium, over $4.20 per bushel in Manitoba compared to barely $3.45 in the US, because Canada could offer something America no longer could, trust. The fallout at home was brutal. Contracts with US cooperatives cancelled. Silos filled to the brim. Farmers in Iowa and Indiana watched as markets they'd served for generations vanished in months. The USDA projected a staggering 2.5 billion bushels, over 68 million tons, of unsold US corn, the highest surplus in 6 years. In Cedar Rapids, prices dropped below $3.75 per bushel, well under the break-even point. Some farmers stopped harvesting altogether, leaving crops to rot in the fields. Meanwhile in Ottawa, Prime Minister Mark Carney's government seized the opportunity. Canadian rail networks optimized grain movement from the prairies to Vancouver with military precision. Export Development Canada rolled out insurance programs to protect even small shipments and subsidized low-emission transport. The result? A machine-like export system that made American delays look amateur. And in a twist of the knife, some Canadian rail carriers started picking up stranded US corn at deep discounts, reprocessing it under Canada's certification system, and reselling it at premium prices. Buyers didn't just want corn, they wanted corn with Canada's stamp of credibility. By the time Washington realized how far the market had shifted, it was too late. Contracts were signed. Trust was established. And America's most lucrative agricultural markets weren't looking south anymore. This isn't just a trade problem. This is an identity crisis for U.S. farming. For decades, U.S. corn was the gold standard. Now it's struggling to find buyers in a market it once controlled. And the brutal truth is this: in global trade, ego doesn't feed anyone. Let's talk about numbers. By spring 2025, U.S. corn exports to Asia fell nearly 18% compared to the previous year. Shipments to the European Union plunged even further. Meanwhile, Canadian exports surged. Japan boosted its Canadian imports by over 40% and locked in long-term deals stretching into the next decade. South Korea signed an organic equivalency agreement with Ottawa, allowing Canadian grain to bypass extra inspections and saving buyers millions, money they reinvested into paying higher prices to Canadian suppliers. The US, however, was stuck in its own red tape. Even shipments that passed US inspections had to be rechecked at foreign ports, adding weeks to delivery schedules. In a just-in-time market, that's a death sentence. And while America's image as an agricultural giant faded, the perception of Canada as the clean, reliable, eco-friendly supplier only grew stronger. The GMO ban in Mexico was just the start. Europe's move toward low-carbon supplier lists hit US corn hard, 90% genetically modified and now labeled as non-compliant. Canada, in contrast, could provide everything buyers demanded. And it wasn't just selling grain. It was selling a narrative, one that perfectly matched the new global food policy direction. In the Midwest, the economic reality was grim. Farmers were losing up to 50 cents per bushel simply because they couldn't find buyers in time. Storage filled so quickly that elevators turned away deliveries. Desperate farmers leased temporary silos or piled corn under tarps, knowing it would degrade. Equipment auctions became common. Land investment firms, many backed by foreign capital, bought distressed farms. Ownership of American farmland, the backbone of U.S. agriculture, was slipping away. The ethanol sector was hit too. With exports stalling, ethanol plants dropped to under 88% capacity. At least 25 facilities went idle, eliminating hundreds of jobs in rural communities. In towns like Columbus, Nebraska, night shifts were cut in half, sending workers home unsure if their jobs would ever return. Canada, meanwhile, doubled down. Export Development Canada rolled out targeted insurance, low-emission transport reimbursements, and optimized rail routes to make deliveries seamless. Grain contracts became tools of diplomacy, strengthening ties in Asia and Europe without ever having to confront Washington directly. Yet in the White House, Trump doubled down on tariffs, insisting they would force buyers back to U.S. markets. But farmers weren't seeing protection. They were watching decades of trust with international partners dissolve, replaced by Canadian contracts. The market wasn't bending back toward the U.S. It was moving on without it. And corn isn't the only crop in danger. Soybeans, with over 90% genetically modified acreage, are already facing European exclusion. Canada and Australia are moving fast to secure those markets with net zero beef and low-carbon soy campaigns. For rural America, the losses are devastating. Coffee shop conversations have shifted from yields and prices to foreclosures, and whether the next generation should even try to farm. The pride of feeding the world is being replaced with the anxiety of survival. Meanwhile, Canada's share grows, contract by contract, ship by ship. If nothing changes, America won't just lose its dominance in corn exports. It will lose the infrastructure, the trust, and the market relationships needed to come back. And when that happens, no tariff, no subsidy, no last-minute policy will fix it. By fall 2025, the evidence was carved into the grain bins. U.S. corn wasn't moving. The surplus was suffocating the market. In Tokyo, Seoul, and Rotterdam, product of USA labels had been replaced by the Canadian flag. And those buyers? They weren't looking back. The USDA's latest projections show billions of dollars worth of corn sitting unsold. The global market is anchored by Canadian contracts fetching 15 to 20% more than US corn. That price difference isn't just about quality, it's about certainty. And right now, that certainty wears a maple leaf. The consequences aren't just economic. They are cultural. Farm bankruptcies are accelerating. Land foreclosures are rising. Family farms are being replaced by corporate holdings with no stake in the community. Small-town schools are shrinking. Storefronts are shuttering. The backbone of American agriculture, its people, is being broken. And yet, in Washington, the political rhetoric remains defiant. Trump frames the crisis as the price of strength in a trade war. But the reality? The allies America once courted with agricultural trade are now tied to Canada through long-term deals that go beyond business. They are about trust, diplomacy, and shared environmental goals. The warning signs for other U.S. agricultural sectors are glaring. If America doesn't adapt, and fast, the corn crisis will become the template for a wider agricultural collapse. Adaptation means dismantling tariffs that alienate buyers, overhauling inspection processes, embracing traceability and low-carbon farming as non-negotiables. Most importantly, it means admitting that global trade is no longer about brute force. It's about trust. Because here's the tragedy, this wasn't inevitable. America had every advantage to lead the next era of global agriculture. But short-term politics and ego-driven policy decisions undermined that potential. While the White House talks about holding the line, America is being left behind in a market that has already moved on. This is the crossroads. One path leads to sweeping reform and renewed leadership. The other leads to isolation, shrinking markets, and the slow death of a way of life. And the world? The world isn't waiting for Washington to decide. Neither is Canada. So the question now is simple: will America reclaim its seat at the table, or watch from the sidelines as someone else eats the meal it once prepared? If you believe these stories matter, if you think the truth about America's place in the world needs to be told, then don't just watch, act. Hit that like button so more people see this. Subscribe for more deep dives into the real forces shaping our future. And tell me in the comments, do you think America can win back these markets, or is this a permanent shift? Because this conversation isn't ending here. It's only just beginning.